We're in Hebrews chapter 12. If you'll be turning to Hebrews chapter 12. And with each of these classes, we kind of focused on one thought or one word or phrase that's kind of the key for that particular section. Last week we talked about the idea of endurance. It was a topic that the writer had introduced back in chapter 10. And then in chapter 12, we're going to return back to that idea of endurance. But today we're also going to be looking at the why. Why is endurance necessary? Does it take endurance to sit down on the couch and watch your favorite TV show? No, not a bit. Or watch a UK basketball game, or go out and walk in the park. Well, maybe the wrong example this year. But the point is, it doesn't take endurance to do the things that are easy, that we enjoy doing, that we get pleasure in doing. So why would the writer make the statement back in chapter 10, verse 35, you have need of endurance? What did that necessarily imply?
It's going to be a long haul.
Yeah, there's going to be challenges. We've talked about this balance, and Mike has pointed out rightly. Jesus talked about my burden is easy, or my yoke is easy, my burden is light. And trying to understand that statement of Jesus in light of what Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 4, everyone who desires to live as a Christian will be persecuted. The writer of Hebrews has emphasized the challenges that they would face, the challenges that Jesus faced. We saw that particularly in what we looked at last week. And it is trying to understand how to harmonize and balance those two concepts. And part of it is understanding that the burden that we bear is not one that Jesus is giving us, it's in fact one that Satan is giving us. Satan is the one who is trying to make it hard to serve Jesus. But recognizing that he is active, roaring lion, as Peter describes him, seeking to devour us at every step, we need endurance to overcome that. And that's what the writer of Hebrews, I guess in one sense you could say that that's what the writer has been leading us to from the very beginning. But now we're getting to that point where the writer is going to explain why it's been this message. To kind of quickly review, we started with our theme at the very beginning. The theme is that we are to be focusing and looking at Jesus every step of the way. That means every day of our lives should be with that conscious look to Jesus. What example did Jesus set for me? What would Jesus want me to do this day with this decision, with this situation that I face? We've seen that all through the book. We've seen this focus on Jesus. We've seen him in his work. We've seen that he took on our nature so that he could be our high priest, so that he could serve for us. We've seen his service as a high priest. Then we get to chapter 11. Chapter 11 is, I think, without any doubt, the most famous chapter in the book of Hebrews. But I would suggest to you that it is an interlude, if you would. It is not the argument itself that's found in the book of Hebrews. What it is illustrations of what this looks like in the lives of people who understand what it means to walk by faith. This is what that looks like in their lives. And then coming back to chapter 12, which we introduced at the end of our last class, the writer takes us here in verse 1, says, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, as we look at all these examples of what does it mean to walk by faith, what does it mean when I trust God more than anything else, even more than what I can see with my eyes, or experience with my physical senses. What does that look like? Well, chapter 11 shows us what it looks like. And then the writer says, since we see what it looks like in their lives, what does it mean for us? Well, what it means is we lay aside everything that is going to distract us, that's going to make it harder for us to walk by faith. Ultimately, that's what our goal is. We live our lives because we trust in the Savior that God sent. And so if there's something that makes that harder for you to do, what do? Lay it aside. Get rid of that. There's so many different things in the Bible that emphasize that point. Jesus talked about the idea of cutting off your hand or pulling out your eye. But it was all that same idea. If there's something that makes it harder for you to make the decision to walk by faith, then get rid of it. Don't put that in front of you. And the sin which so easily entangles us, that trips us up, that keeps us from doing this. And then he said in verse 2, look. And we talked about this idea of this looking is a unique word. It's found in Philippians chapter 2, where Paul talks about the fact that he had sent, I think it was Titus at that point, but I've really forgotten who it was. But he had sent someone, and he was planning to do something, but he says, I first need to see what is going to happen to me. So this idea of seeing was to get information. And that's the same word that's used here. So when the writer of Hebrews says, focus on or look at Jesus, looking to Jesus, it means look to Jesus to learn something. Learn how Jesus decided things, what actions Jesus took. Learn from that. So looking at it to learn at it. And he is the author and perfecter. He's the source of our faith, but he's also the goal of what that faith should look like. He shows us what it is perfected. Again, don't think perfection, no sin, that he had no sin. Certainly he had no sin, but that's not the point the writer is getting at. What he's showing us is this is what a mature faith looks like. This is what our goal is, to have that mature faith. So we look at Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. And then we come down to verse 4. This is where we're going to start. Well, let me emphasize one other point. The last part of verse 2, notice what it says about Jesus. Endured the cross, despised the shame, sat down at the right hand of the throne of God, endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you may not grow weary and lose heart. What is the writer emphasizing about the ministry of Jesus? Yeah, exactly. The ministry of Jesus was difficult. We see that word endurance here. We see despise. We see growing weary or don't grow weary. The ministry of Jesus was a challenge. We saw it in the Garden of Eden, or not, the Garden of Gethsemane. When the angels came and ministered to him, he needed that. And we need to recognize that it's going to be a challenge for us to walk in his footsteps. So that's what the writer is emphasizing. Look at Jesus. Don't look at Jesus having an easy road. Look at Jesus going through challenges. And yet, despite those challenges, he overcame. And through his power, we can overcome also. Let me rephrase that. We will overcome. If we put our trust in God, the same God that Jesus put his trust in, then there is no question we will overcome. We will succeed, and as the book of Romans says, exceedingly abundantly beyond all that we imagine or all that we can think or imagine. So then we come to verse 4. And here's the point where if you had started this letter reading chapter 12 and verse 4, what effect would that have had on you? You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. Is that the way you start a letter? I don't think that's the way to start. It's clearly the writer of Hebrews doesn't start that way. But it's also clear that's where that writer was going to. What does that necessarily imply for them? By the way, this is a common Greek term. It was used to describe martyrs. Not just Christian martyrs, but just anyone who died because of their zeal or commitment to a particular cause. The idea of a martyr is not just someone who's murdered randomly, but it's someone who dies because they are committed to something that they believe in more than anything else in the world. How's that going to affect the people that, wherever they were, whoever it was that wrote to them that got this letter? Someone is standing or before the group and reading this letter to them. How is that going to affect the people that are hearing that letter and knowing this is written to me, to us?
It indicates it's a possibility.
Yep. And I would go further. I would say it's a certainty that it will happen. It's just a matter of time. That's kind of chilling. It's kind of hard for us to even imagine, really. I'm not going to get into politics, but I remember when in our state there was the challenge that the state police were going to come and write down license plates of people who would assemble to worship on Sunday. How did that make us feel? And that is nowhere near close to describing what the writer of Hebrews just said. I have been in places, I've been in communist China, and I know that there are Christians who just disappeared. And their brothers and sisters didn't know anything about them except for the fact that the government was not happy about the fact that they attested to be Christians. And they never heard from them again. What are we going to do in a situation like that? That's what the writer of Hebrews is preparing these people to face. That's the challenge. Are you going to walk by faith when that happens? Let's go back to Jesus. What effect did it have in Jerusalem among his disciples when they saw him being led to Golgotha? Well, we know the disciples that were with him in the garden. They ran away. We know the women of Jerusalem because it's described how that they were weeping for him as they saw him carrying his cross through the streets of Jerusalem. We also saw the effect that it had on Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, that they were strengthened in their faith. That's obviously what the writer of Hebrews is trying to prepare these Christians to face. Make the choice that you're going to be strengthened. As you look at Jesus carrying his cross, does that make you stronger? Does that make you weaker? Go ahead, John.
Yeah, going back a little, but I have a question for you.
Sure.
There's verse 2, and the New American Standard talks about, I read it as Jesus despising the shame. I know some versions say scorning the shame.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read it, to me it just means
That's my understanding also. I actually relate this to Paul in Philippians 3, where he talked about all the things that were gained to me I consider to be refuge. You know, they were of no value to him at all. In fact, a negative. They'd be tossed out in the trash. And I think Jesus was looking at that kind of the same way. Yes, there was shame. He wore the shame of our sins. But he did not let that value him. He didn't consider that to be a value. That's my reading of that. Anybody else with thoughts, sir? So we see this idea where the writer drops this bomb on them. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. You will. I mean, that's the clear indication here. You will get to that point. Of course, we know historically that's exactly what does happen, that they do get to this point where they are shedding blood. And then he goes to the Old Testament. And interestingly, he goes to the book of Proverbs in chapter 3, a section that talks about parenting. And talks about the idea of a father disciplining his children. But even in the book of Proverbs chapter 3, verses 11 and 12 is where we're at. We see where the writer of Proverbs, Solomon, talks about this idea of a father disciplining his child and uses it or relates it to God disciplining his children. And so the writer of Hebrews does exactly the same thing. And uses this analogy of a father who disciplines his son and relates it to the idea of God disciplining his children. So let's talk about this idea of discipline. That's really kind of going to be our focus for our class today. You probably have heard this before, but it's always good to remember it. Discipline is not synonymous with punishment. It may include punishment, but it is not synonymous with punishment. In fact, the word discipline is the same root as the word disciple. So are disciples of Jesus always punished by Jesus? Of course not. But what are they? They are trained by Jesus. Yeah, exactly, all of those things.
Is not wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the right way. It's teaching. And it's the same in the Bible. It's not wrong. It's teaching.
Exactly.
Sometimes we have to be corrected.
Exactly. Lisa, for those who couldn't hear, emphasizing the idea of teaching, education, training. Discipline is neutral in itself. But its goal, its purpose, is to help someone learn better, be better. Thank you for that point. And since Lisa's a teacher, a very good person to bring that out. That's exactly the idea that the writer of Hebrews is trying to get us to understand. God is educating, teaching, training us. Even with this point of not yet shedding blood. Ultimately, what the writer of Hebrews is trying to get them to understand, that this whole process is God preparing us to be his disciples. Just like Jesus was prepared. Remember, we saw that back in chapter 5. What did Jesus have to learn? He had to learn how to obey. And it's still just, even though we talked about it, it still is one of those things where it just is kind of mind-boggling to imagine. God Almighty has to learn something. Well, God Almighty has to learn how to submit. Because that's what obedience means. Obedience necessarily requires submission. Obedience is not just, well, I agree with you, so I'm going to do what you want me to do. Obedience is, I'm going to do what you want me to do because I submit to your authority. So Jesus had to learn how to obey. And how did he learn how to obey? Through suffering. Through challenges. And so we have to learn. We have to be disciplined. We have to be trained by God. And sometimes that training can be violent. It wasn't the case of Jesus. And that's what the writer of Hebrews is getting them to the point of, is to recognize that this training is necessary so that they can have endurance. We've all seen elite athletes, and they make it look so easy. But what did they have to do to get to that point where it looked so easy? Yeah, they had to go through challenging, difficult training to do that. They had to go times where, there's always the question, is this really worth it? And in some cases they say no, and we don't see those people on TV. They're the ones who gave up. But the ones who didn't give up are the ones that become a success. All of this section is really bringing us to the culmination of what the writer had introduced back in chapter 10. Remember, what are the three commands in the book of Hebrews? Really the only three commands that we've ever looked at. Starting in chapter 10, verse 22. I maybe should have started with this. There's three commands there. Anybody remember? I'm really feeling bad as a teacher now.
I'm just looking at it, so draw near.
Draw near is the first one, absolutely. What's the second one? Hold fast. Exactly. And then consider how to stimulate one another. Draw near, hold fast, consider how to stimulate one another. Everything from that point on is just illustrating what those things mean, what they look like. That's what we saw in chapter 11. These are just examples of people who were drawing near to God, holding fast to their confession of God, and thinking about how they could stimulate others to do the same. So when the writer here is talking about this, you're not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood, and talking about this idea of disciplining, it's God preparing us to do these three things. Draw near, hold fast, stimulate one another. Look at verse 6. And this comes from Proverbs 3. But it's so important that we understand it. Why does God discipline us? Why does he want to train us? Because he loves us. And we live in a culture, in a world that says the exact opposite. If you love your children, what do? Well, you let them do whatever they want. You make them happy. That's how you show your love. Isn't that what our world teaches? A significant portion of our world, I'll say that. Now, God is the one who knows love better than any of us. And God demonstrated his love by disciplining his people. Sometimes that included punishment, but it always was training to help them to be better. And that's what the writer is connecting us to show us how that affects in our lives, both for us and, as we're going to see in a moment, our relationship with one another. The last part of verse 8. If you are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. The term that is translated there literally means a child without a father. Notice how he's saying it here. And again, this is a great message for us as a sidelight. Parents who do not discipline their children are raising children who have no parent. Oh, they may physically have a parent, but they don't have a parent for what a child truly needs. And if we want God to stop giving us discipline, stop giving us, don't let these challenges happen to me, make everything easy for me. What we're asking God to do is, don't be a part of my life. That's not what I want. I want the perfect God being the perfect Father to me. And whatever that means, I trust God, faith, that it's good for me. And I shall rejoice and appreciate that training of God. And so what's the purpose of discipline? Endurance. Again, we go back to chapter 10. You have need of endurance. If you need endurance, you need discipline. Plain and simple. That's what it does. Verses 9 and 10. Again, I apply it first of all to our modern culture, and then let's apply it spiritually. We had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. And the fact is that fathers who do discipline their children also gain their respect. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, when I was reading this, I didn't really see endurance as a discipline being to build up your endurance. The discipline is what the Christians are enduring. Because you see that in verse 7. If ye endure chastening, God deals with you as sons. So the chastening is what you are to endure. And I feel like he's saying all these bad things are happening to you. But, and men are doing it to you. But ultimately, this is coming from God. That nothing happens without God's approval. You see that in Job.
Exactly.
We read it, and we're like, Satan did that. But when you look at what God says, you have provoked me against him without cause. So God takes ownership of that because he could have stopped it from happening.
Right.
And so I feel like God is taking ownership of these persecutions that the Christians are enduring. And if the Christians say, God, you could stop this if you wanted to, and God's response is, absolutely. I own this. I am letting this happen to you. And Paul sort of explained the reason. God's letting this happen to you because you don't realize it, but you need this. And you need to endure the punishment, and then there'll be the benefit. But I don't see the benefit. I don't see where it's saying that the benefit of the endurance of the punishment is more endurance. I think endurance is what they need to get through the chastisement.
Yes. I'm going to argue it's both. And I think it goes, actually, you mentioned Paul, although we don't know if Paul was writer of Hebrews, but I do it too.
Almost did that last week, and I caught it.
But I think it's important to connect to Romans 1:17. Romans 1:17 is the theme for the book of Romans. And it says that faith is unto faith, from faith to faith. And I'm going to argue that that's the same thing the writer of Hebrews is making, that endurance is to endurance. He said back in chapter 10, in verse 35, you have need of endurance. So they needed endurance. That was something that was important for them to have. And then I think everything that he's talking about is explaining how you get that endurance. And I think you're right. Part of it is enduring to have more endurance. Go ahead.
That's fine, but one thing that troubles me with passages like this is, ultimately, what else do you get? If I endure this, what do I get? Well, I get more endurance. Okay, but ultimately, why do I need more endurance? If endurance is just for the sake of, if I need endurance, I can have more endurance, and then I can build more endurance. Ultimately, what is the benefit of having endurance? I mean, if it's all by, if we have faith, you don't get any, I mean, because if you take a very sort of Catholic view of things,
Right.
then you're like, well, you need endurance so you can get into heaven. But if you don't take that view, what do we need the endurance for?
Let me say just this broad answer. We get to that in chapter 13. Actually, the end of chapter 12 and chapter 13. is the ultimate conclusion of what the author has been, this path that he's been taking us through. But yes, I agree with you. Ultimately, it's not just simply to say have more endurance. There is a goal for that. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, and on that too, I think verse 10 and 11 also gives us some of the outcome of the endurance is more holiness like the Lord, and then the fruit of righteousness.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And let me go ahead and just go into that because I got behind on my. He talks about the fact that in verse 10, they disciplined us for a short time as seemed best to them. There's two qualifying phrases here about the discipline of an earthly father. One is it's a short time. Great lesson for those who are fathers now, thinking that someday I'm really going to sit down with my son or my daughter and I'm going to teach them things. You only have a short time. You have a God-given responsibility today to be a father. Don't put that off to the future. But then the second thing is, he says, it's as seems best to them. To me, this is very much the writer doing kind of the same thing that we do when we talked about human beings. We say, well, we're not perfect. Absolutely. And so the writer makes the point, the father does what seems best to him. He's doing the best job he can do. And yet the result of that is respect. That's what the writer said. We respect them. Now, what's the obvious implication? When we have the Father of spirits, how long is his discipline? How long is your lifespan? That's the same answer. As long as you're on this side of the 6 feet under, then God is disciplining you. And what's obviously also implied is it's the right discipline every single time. It may not feel like it at the time. It may feel like, God, why are you letting me go through this again? But it is what is good for me right now. God knows that, and I have to trust God on that. So then we get to the section that David was talking about. The verse 11, all discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet to those who have been trained by it, afterward it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. This is actually the second time we see this phrase, afterward. We saw it back in this is the first time. The second one is in verse 17. But I want to look at both of them side by side and also recognize they're not the same word. Even though they're translated in New American Standard by the same word, they are actually different words in Greek. But I do think it's helpful to look at the distinction. So it says the one who is going through the discipline at the time it's sorrowful. But then it says afterward. That word that is translated afterward there means in the end. It's actually the last of a sequence of events or times or whatever. So the very last one. So in the end, at the end of the time, what does it do? It yields this fruit of righteousness, the peaceful fruit of righteousness. So there's a contrast between the sorrow of the discipline and the peace of the fruit of righteousness. So that's part of it to understand is that while we go through God's discipline right now, we may not understand. But by faith, we will know, remember that's that realization, we will know that in the end, it's all worth it. Go ahead, Mike.
Is there any connection to what you're saying here to what it says about Jesus? In verse 2, it says, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him, that's the outcome.
I
Through the cross.
think you're exactly right. I think that's exactly the point. Jesus went through what he went through because he knew in the end that it would save some. I think that's exactly right. So that is a very partial answer to Mike's question. What's the outcome of this endurance? In the end, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. But then we go on. Here, verse 12 is where we kind of transition from the idea of hold fast your confession to consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds. But it still is connected with this idea of discipline. And we have our transition word, therefore. So verse 12 starts with therefore. And essentially what the writer has said is, you see how that God's discipline helps you. Therefore, what do we do with each other? We discipline each other. Now again, I got to emphasize, this doesn't mean we go out punishing people. What it does mean is we do what Lisa does with her children. We train them. We educate them. There are times where Lisa has to punish, chastise, correct behavior that is destructive. It's destructive to the child. That's why she's trying to correct it. It also destroys what's going on in the classroom. That is exactly the point that the writer of Hebrews is getting. Do you see a knee that is weak? A limb that is out of joint spiritually? Do you see someone among your number who is struggling in their faith? They don't appear to be walking by faith. In fact, maybe just the opposite. They may be appearing to abandon their faith. What do? We reach out to train them, to educate them, to correct them, to discipline them. We consider how to stimulate them to love and good deeds. And a congregation that does not do that is a congregation that does not love. That's biblical language. It is the most unloving thing that you can do to ignore someone who is clearly struggling in their faith and just to lead them to Satan. It's a challenge, no question. We all understand that we are not God. We are not going to be perfect. We do what seems best to us in light of the teachings of God, just like an earthly father does his children. And the reason why is because this is too dangerous to ignore. You simply cannot let that go. Look at what he says beginning in verse 15. We'll go back to verse 14 in a moment. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled. That there be no immoral or godless person like Esau. What a fascinating story to bring up. The story of Esau and Jacob. Of course, Esau was the slightly older one. He was loved by his father Isaac. Jacob, the slight younger one, was loved by his mother Rebekah. And we know two different stories in the life of Esau where he lost the right to be considered the older brother. One he gave up for a bowl of stew. The other one he lost through the deception of his brother. And yet look at what the writer says about Esau. He was godless and immoral. Gave up his birthright for a single meal. He despised that which God had given him for a single meal. And you know that even afterward, and here's that other phrase, afterward. And this just means what comes immediately after. when he realized he had lost the birthright, had lost the blessing, and the idea of the writer has really conflated those two together. Even though they were separate things, they both related to being the firstborn. And it says that even afterward, he desired it with tears. He realized what he'd thrown away. And he begged his father, please give it back. And Isaac told him, I can't. I can't give it back. It's gone forever. Now the writer is telling us, you need to look at your brothers and sisters that are struggling in faith and realize that it may be something that's gone forever. What are you going to do? That's why it's so important that we have this sense of community, that we have this sense of family. It's not because we're, interfering in other people's lives. It's not because we're being busybodies or nosy. It's because we cannot sit by and watch our brothers and sisters lose something that will be gone forever. Anybody with any thoughts or comments down through this point? Go ahead.
I find it, I'm going back up to, it talks about the peaceful fruit of righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
I find that the fact that they used peaceful to describe peaceful fruit of righteousness, they used joyful, they used holy, that they chose peaceful. And I just think that the verse, like Colossians 3:15, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as rulers of one body you were called to peace. And there's so many verses about how Jesus calls us to peace.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like Romans 15:13, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with the hope of the power of the Holy Spirit. I just feel like that kind of all leads forward. Like with that peace, we have hope, we have that joy, we have the calmness knowing that we're being led by the Holy Spirit. I
Exactly.
just felt that was like just a really interesting way to describe the use of peaceful.
Exactly. And especially in the context of everything we've been talking about. Doesn't it just suddenly shine out as a bright beacon? I mean, everything else has been endurance, has been the struggles, the challenges, the resisting to the point of shedding blood. It's all been, do we say depressing or frightening to look at? And then suddenly we just had that bright light, the peaceful fruit of righteousness. And that's a good transition to verse 14. Let's look at, I said we'd come back to this. Look at verse 14. Pursue peace with all men. So what is it that pursues peace in this context? What is it that pursues peace? It is not saying you just do what you want to do and I'll do what I want to do, and we're all just going to coexist. We're all going to be in peaceful harmony with one another. That is not what it means. But what it does mean is that we will discipline one another. We will train, we will educate, we will teach, we will set an example for one another. We will, put the limbs that are out of joint, put them back into place. We'll strengthen the knees that are weak. That's what it means to pursue peace with all men. And the sanctification without which no one will see the Lord. We saw that back in chapter 6. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. Without sanctification, you will not see the Lord. So this idea of discipline, the writer has really hammered home the importance of discipline. And again, remembering everything that is encompassed by that term. But it absolutely is, at the time, seems to be sorrowful. But in the end, it is all worth it. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments? Well, we're going to pick up at verse 18 next week. And just as a spoiler alert, this is what we've been pointing towards. This is what the whole writer, this whole book has been pointing towards what we're going to look at next week. Remember, Jesus is appointed a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, Psalm 110. Please go back this week and read Psalm 110. There are two things about Jesus in that psalm. We've seen one of them through most of the book of Hebrews. We're going to see the other thing starting next week. Thank you.